When I was a little girl, I would sit at the dinner table and revel in my father telling stories about the civil rights. And I have an active imagination, so I just envisioned my father at all of those strategic places, walking across that bridge in Selma, sitting at those lunch counters, standing on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial. I even envisioned my father burning bras during the women's movement. I don't know whose bras he was burning, but it was very exciting to see my father out fighting the good fight. But as I got a little older, my father got a little more successful, and suddenly the only handicap he seemed to revel was his golf score. The next thing I knew, we were living in a gated community. My father was driving a convertible Mercedes. And so I decided that if I wanted to fight the good fight and go off to college, that maybe I would do so standing in front of a judge. I went off to college, and as I was pursuing law, there was this moment in time when I turned to my television like so many folks, and I saw this young man standing in front of a tank in Tiananmen Square. And I'll never forget that moment. He stood there, so resolute and so passionate. And it was so much bigger than him, whether it was about democracy or freedom or education. And as I fixated on that moment, I realized I wanted to stand up for something. When I thought about my cleats or my pom-poms or that tiara or even those Greek letters, I realized I had never stood up for anything. So at that moment, I decided that I wanted to be a teacher. And I remember calling my father, and he didn't take the news so well. He quickly reminded me that teachers don't make any money, which is true. He also told me that I would never afford a home in Newport Beach, which is still true to this day. But no matter how cynical my father was about my new chosen profession, I thought it's bigger than a dollar or a paycheck. It's that aha moment. Well, shortly after I made that decision to stand up, I turned on my television again and watched the Los Angeles riots unfold. And I remember seeing the faces of young kids who were so angry, and justifiably. Kids who had their back against the wall, kids who didn't have a voice, kids who would reach for their fist or a spray can, or worse yet, reach for a Molotov cocktail and destroy something. So I had another epiphany. At that moment, I realized I not only wanted to teach, but I wanted to teach those kids. Once again, I picked up the phone, I called my father on the golf course, and he made all kinds of cynical jokes. The most important was, no matter what you do, please don't eat the apples, because he convinced himself they were laced with strychnine or razor blades. So I want to tell you about my first day on the job. I wore the exact same dress that Julia Roberts wore in the film Pretty Woman. I had polka dots, I had pearls, and as I was about to leave my house and make that 45-minute drive down Pacific Coast Highway in my convertible White Rabbit, I started thinking about all of those great stories that I'd read from the literary canon. Stories by Homer, stories by Shakespeare. And as I made that drive, I wondered what kind of stories I was going to read with my students. But they had a story of their own, because I quickly found out in their city, shortly after the Los Angeles riots, there was 126 murders. 126. So I walked into my classroom, there was no textbooks, there was no technology, and I looked at students who were miserable. Students at the age of 14 who were told they were going to fail and drop out of school by the end of their 9th grade year. Students who desperately believed that they would be behind bars by the time they were 16. And worse yet, students who believed they would be 6 feet under by the time they turned 18. My students had never read a book from cover to cover, nor did they intend to. They hated reading, they hated writing, and the only thing that seemed to bring them together in perfect harmony was they really hated me, this perky, annoying person with my polka dots and my pearls. And if you don't believe me, I'd like to show you a brief clip to show you what that first day was like and what my students thought of their teacher, this cheerleader from hell.
Looking around at them, it was like looking at nothing, because I didn't care.
A lot of the students were just bad, you know? And I didn't expect ERIN to try to teach us anything. I knew that she was nothing more than a babysitter.
It was very evident that they didn't want to be there. I could walk into my classroom and I could tell who's pissed off, who's jaded, who's hungry, who's bored, who can't wait to get out of here, who hates my guts. It's easy to be perceptive and to be in the moment. But to be in the moment, you have to be vulnerable. I had to walk in there and not have a guard up.
I think anybody in that situation, you gotta be scared out of your mind. You have to be scared out of your mind. Have to be. Have to be. Because not only are you dealing with people that don't care that you're a teacher, they don't care about you. It's personal.
It's personal. So looking at these students, I realized, how can I get them to put down that fist, to put down that spray can, or worse yet, put down that gun? Because in my classroom, I had students who just came from juvenile hall, had ankle monitors around their leg, and a probation officer. Students who just came from rehab for crystal meth or crack cocaine. Students who bounced around from foster home to group home to shelter. Students who would never turn in their homework or have their parents bake me brownies, and if they did, I probably shouldn't eat them. And most of my students could care less about these dead white guys in tights. Dead white guys in tights like togas or Shakespeare. And so what I try to do is to figure out, how can I teach my students that they have a story? Because we all have a story. So I decided that we were going to play a game that was anything but a game. And I was going to simply put this piece of tape down the center of my floor and ask my students questions. And hopefully that line could be a gravitational pull. And as my students would stand on that line, I would know where they stood. I would know their story. As the questions began, I believe that 150 kids who walked into my classroom at the age of 14, all of them were poor. In fact, all of them knew in the pit of their stomach what it felt like to not know when that next meal was coming from, to be so proud that they didn't want to turn in that meal ticket at school. All of them knew what it felt like to go home and the lights have been turned off again. There's no food in that fridge again. And those hardworking single moms with those cockroaches and those roaches were never going to get ahead.